Welcome to the Last American Vagabond. Joining me today, I'm very excited to be discussing this topic with Dr. Peter McCullough, and it's something that we have been diving through the last so many weeks, if not longer, in regard to the larger topic of the transgender movement. But more specifically, as you guys have seen, I recently dove into the concept of endocrine disrupting chemicals and what that might be causing in regard specifically in regard to gender dysphoria. And as you remember, we went through this, and there's obviously an interesting connection there. We went over things like glyphosate, dioxins, PFAS, and even the COVID-19 injection in particular. So I wanted to invite Dr. Peter McCullough on to discuss this and the overlaps to a lot of different things and how these things intersect. Thank you for joining me today. It's nice to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me. Sometimes I feel like I'm the last American vagabond in a post-apocalyptic world, like the introduction, but great to be on your show. Great journalism on the Vagabond. So happy to be back. And boy, what a hot topic we have.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's nice to hear that. Well, yeah, I mean, what's more alarming to me than anything is that how I keep finding that these things kind of intersect, whether we're just talking about generally like issues on reproductivity and infertility or any number of other ways they kind of overlap. So for me, it started with this kind of discussion of gender dysphoria. And I was interested in how I was realizing that there's this interesting contradiction right now in the community, where it started where people were saying, well, gender dysphoria is why we need to help people and give them treatments because there's a disorder. And then it very quickly, which is what the community is now saying, switched into, well, that's not true. We can pick what we want. And there's a concerning issue there when it comes to the things they're doing, puberty blockers and what that can cause. But so when I started diving into it, I also found that these chemicals themselves that go back long before this movement, even before COVID-19, that show that there has been a building problem with these chemicals, endocrine disrupting chemicals, that are scientifically being shown to lead to gender dysphoria. So I don't know where you want to start with this, but there's a lot to get into. So
well,
go ahead.
Let's start at the really big level here. This is such an interesting observation. Do you know right now in Russia, Vladimir Putin is trying to get a handle on transgenderism. They're trying to ban transgender surgeries in hormonal therapy in young people because it's popped up as a problem. The same thing is true in Indonesia. They're Indonesia. And you go anywhere in the world, Christian, transgenderism has popped up. It's like sprung up organically all over the world. So Americans are actually late. We're actually late. Usually America leads the world in various trends. No, this one is different. The Dutch had been having transgender clinics now for 15 years, widely utilized ones. So they were considered one of the leaders. You can find their literature going back. One of the things, a paper that struck my eye by Vander Meesen and colleagues about 15 years ago, is that of young people coming forward for transgender surgeries and hormones, 20% of them had clinical autism in the chart.
Wow.
20%. And we know that autism is a spectrum. It's a wide spectrum. In fact, there's related disorders, ADD, attention deficit disorder, tic-Dilarow, and others, Asperger's. And it's in a grouping of neuropsychiatric disease called essence. They're essence diseases. And so that was one observation that I thought was very striking. I said, wait a minute. When I was a kid, the rate of autism was 1 in 10,000. Now it's 1 in 36. So there is an epidemic of autism, and it is curvilinear straight upward. If something isn't done, we're going to be enveloped in autism before you know it, because it's occurring at much more frequent incident rates. Now there's greater detection of it, but it doesn't explain exponential rates. So there's an exponential epidemic of autism. There's an explosion of transgenderism all over the world at the same time. US is actually lagging a little bit. Autism is there. And when we look at the papers that go back and try to examine this, particularly from autism perspective, since the Autism Transgender Association is solid. And let me just finish that association. A question was asked among those with transgenderism and LGBT, wider than that, if they are given psychometric surveys for autism, and that was done in a paper by Warrior and colleagues published in Nature, they score off the Richter scale for autism. So that paper was convincing, 600,000 people in that study. And to make it more clear, that now that there are steps to try to ban transgender programs in the youth in some states, you know who's strongly opposing any of that legislation? They are out there strongly opposing anything that bans transgenderism, and they're strongly promoting transgender medicine. It's the Autism Advocacy Network. So autistic people as adults, they want transgender medicine bad, and they're activists. So autism, I think, plays a big role. So just on this autism epidemic for a second, what do we know there? We know that older adults is a risk factor, and then siblings with autism is a risk factor. But that can't explain from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 36. So everything's on the table. We should have a Manhattan Project right now on, is it something in the water supply? Is it the fluoridation of waters, something else, something in the food supply? You mentioned herbicides, glyphosate as an example. One theory is that it's vitamin A, that there's hypervitaminosis A. There's vitamin A containing various baby formulas. There's some children who ate way too many carrots and they turn orange as a theory. One theory in childhood is actually that it's either certain vaccines that's been introduced or hypervaccination that is multiplicity. So when I was a kid, again, autism was 1 in 10,000. Let's just go back to then. We had the oral polio vaccine, diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, and then smallpox. There was 5 things. Now a child today is facing, I think, 16 different diseases, 72 shots. That's before COVID. It's an absolute intense salvo of vaccines at a very early age. Some of the vaccines are neurotropic. This is important to point out. So for instance, rubella German measles is a neurotropic virus. And in the 60s, when we had a lot of congenital rubella, I think the rubella vaccine is pretty compelling, by the way. We had 20,000 cases of congenital rubella in the United States. We're down to like 2 per year. I mean, so the vaccine, which appropriately should just be for young girls as they approach childbearing years, it doesn't do anything in guys because guys don't really get German measles. It's but although the vaccine's been blanketed to everybody, it's in the MMR, so everyone's gotten it. But what we know is in the 60s, when kids survived pregnancy and had congenital rubella, about 10% of them had clinical autism. The phenotype was autistic. So the rubella vaccine today actually is a live attenuated vaccine. It's in the MMR vaccine. So could it be the virus itself or neurotropic cytokines, inflammatory factors? But I think there's about 80 papers now about vaccines and autism. The thing that's impressed me as an epidemiologist is the vignettes where a child is completely normal. The parents are tracking the milestones. They got experienced parents. The child gets a barrage of vaccines, potentially 6 to maybe 8 different ones all at once, gets sick, has a fever, and then a seizure. And then a febrile seizure or a near seizure, some tonic-clonic activity, some jerking. And then afterwards, in the defervescence, the parents notice the child is different. The eyes are not tracking appropriately. They're not suckling the same. The developmental milestones become missed. They develop characteristic hyperacusis, where they can have enhanced hearing and take on the features of autism or Asperger's. These vignettes are striking. The literature is loaded with them. Parents listening to this will know what I'm talking about. It's now, to several big events, Christian, Les Clay Clark, I asked for a show of hands. I said, how many people are touched by autism? It means a family member, someone in their circles, etc. A third of people raise their hand. So autism is that big. Those approaching the gender journey, it may be the majority. Honestly, it may be. And it explains. So when I was a kid, and especially in the pre-pubertal years, I can't recall a single transgender person. I can't. In the 1960s, I can't recall one. Now, estimates are Gen Z that 20% are LGBT, and the transgender is becoming, as we saw in the display in the White House now, mainstream. Biden, it was wide open sexuality. There was bare breasts on the White House lawn. So it's not just transgenderism. It's not just gender dysphoria, but it's hypersexuality. We're seeing it through the literature. children being exposed to graphical sexual images, drag queens. And so the children, and I think particularly autistic children, may be impressionable and very impressionable and be brought up to the precipice of potentially being suggestible with gender dysphoria. And gender dysphoria, by the way, is common. It means people don't like their gender. A lot of times the term gender ambiguity is used. What I can tell you as a doctor, I have autistic people in my practice. I have transgender people in my practice. I have great diversity, equity, inclusion, because we take care of drug abusers and criminals and fat people and thin people and gay and lesbian. So doctors are very, very liberal, I would say, in terms of dealing with people. It's part of our job. But I can tell you, it's been my observation that that a young person with gender ambiguity, the best cure for that is to go through normal puberty.
Right.
To go through normal puberty, because it's puberty not only changes the external appearance and the genitalia, et cetera, hair patterns, but it actually changes the mind. So normal male puberty makes a male brain. The brain is actually not really yet a male brain until we go through puberty. The same thing for a girl to be a woman's brain. So all children should go through normal puberty. And what we're seeing now is the use of interrupting that with puberty blockers. These are gonadotropin releasing hormone agonists that affect the pituitary. And then post-puberty, we're seeing the use of androgens or estrogens, which are very disruptive. A recent paper published by Santos and colleagues, this is important, from Portugal, of children who start to take these hormones in young people, 89% get sick.
Wow.
Because remember, they have a normal process in their body. So if a normal boy post-puberty is a lot of testosterone, give him estrogens, he's going to get sick. They're going to have mood swings, nausea, vomiting, acne, skin rashes, sleeplessness. They're absolutely miserable with these hormones. I want the parents to understand that. That's what the published literature shows.
Right. And so their body's essentially rejecting that, is what that sounds like, right? It's just not natural. Well, I want to go back to a couple of points you made about autism, and then we can get into the different parts of that. 89%, that's just absolutely staggering. But you mentioned something about autism from before where you said there was a 10% association prior to the increase. And then can you revisit that for me? Because that's really like,
no, the observation was long time ago, children who survived the congenital rubella syndrome, who actually, the mothers got rubella. Remember, when I was born, there was no rubella vaccine. We got German measles if it was going around. But the children who survived, the mothers who had it, about 10% had clinical autism back then as a manifestation of congenital rubella. Well, now the autism that's developing, obviously people aren't getting rubella, they're taking the vaccine, but the vaccines probably not individually are associated with autism, but it's hypervaccination. It's giving them all at once, causing all of these inflammatory factors and cytokines that go into the brain and then evoke the pathophysiology of autism.
Right. And that's kind of what I wanted to focus on. Is it's interesting that, so this just kind of rings true with what I was just talking about my show today, is that we have these examples historically where, so they can tell that the rubella vaccine had this association before it was used in the MMR vaccine. Right. And then we've got the MMR discussion today from people like Del Bigtree and past showing you that there was an association with autism. So there was a precedent for it right before it even became MMR. What I think is fascinating and alarming and disgusting at the same time is that, maybe you can tell me whether or not this is the case. All these vaccines given to children, even in particular MMR, they're not tested alongside each other, are they? And that's where the over-vaccination probably comes in and where this is likely a culprit. Is that a fair statement?
They don't undergo prospective, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials, which is our gold standard, and they should, because not only do they give inferences on efficacy, but also safety. Safety comes first, and these vaccines are very lightly tested. For instance, hepatitis B given on the first day of life, there's typically 5 days of follow-up in these studies. They just measure some antibodies. Many times the antibodies are not a good surrogate for immunity. We know this because modern outbreaks, for instance, of measles, about half the kids are fully vaccinated. Same thing with mumps. Half the kids are fully vaccinated. I recently reviewed Haemophilus influenza serotype B. Most of the infections in the United States are non-typable, so the vaccine wouldn't even cover that. But of those who got sick, it was only 77 cases in about 10 years. 3/4 of them were fully vaccinated. So I think what's making the diseases go away is not the vaccines, but it's improved living conditions, hygiene, water, etc. And what the what the vaccine community has done is they've taken their eye off of safety, and now these safety signals have crept in years later, and boy, people are burning with regret.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like we're not allowed to talk about these things, and the assumption is that they're safe without question. But so this is where we get into the overlap to all this, right? So obviously there's the valid concern there, and the autism alone, that conversation should be enough to further investigate, to pause, right? But now what we're seeing, and this is really interesting, especially for my audience, and I didn't know this until today, that there's an overlap with gender dysphoria and autism, right? So what else could be adding to this? So if we can see that, we also have the discussion of the endocrine disrupting chemicals that are seemingly ubiquitous around the planet, right? So do you think that this is, as you were talking about before, kind of a converging of multiple factors that's causing people to question their sexuality, and that's being kind of taken advantage of? Is that how you see this playing out?
It's true. I mean, what else could be? Again, it's either something in the air, water, or food. I mean, environment, because it's neuropsychiatric. That's very important. So the neurological part of it's very important. It just can't be from using cell phones, or it can't be from playing computer games, because it wouldn't cause the hyperacusis. It wouldn't cause some of these other neurologic features that we see, the tics and utteral, the kind of guttural types of auditory abnormalities. So it's got to be something organic. And in the food supply, you bring out the ubiquitous use of hormones, for instance, particularly in chicken. A normal chicken that's born from an egg takes about 3 months to grow up out on a farm. But when placed in a metal cage, and they have lights shine on it 24/7, feeding them hormones, that egg grows up to a full chicken in 30 days. It's very unnatural. And if you ever see a chicken breast, you put it on the barbecue, that's bigger than a man's chicken breast nowadays. They're enormous. And so hormones coming through the food supply, we don't know how many of them are destroyed in the cooking process and the curing process. But it is interesting to note, a child born today in China will be 9 inches taller than their grandparents who were born, let's say, it's just incredible. The differences in the human morphology. And what is it? Is it just protein, or is it hormones, or something else? People are gradually getting taller. So men are getting taller. If you noticed, younger people, Christian, you and I are kind of a little bit on the short side. I don't want to disappoint our audience, but people are growing taller. So the human body is changing, and with these changes, could gender dysphoria be a part of us? Well, certainly hormones in the food supply are there. Vitamin A and glyphosate are interesting. Glyphosate is what's in Roundup. It's a ubiquitous herbicide. And so crops are sprayed with this, and then the crops are genetically engineered to be able to survive the Roundup. That's what's called a GMO, a genetically modified organism. And so now we have all different types of plants that we eat and food that we eat are genetically modified to survive the herbicide. And so the question on the table is it okay? Should we eat these? And no one really knows. Many have said, listen, just get rid of the Roundup. Let's find some other way to manage the weeds. And so we can deal with this. The other thing that's going on is vaccinating the meat supply. So what we know there is in pigs, in swine, the use of genetic vaccines is going on now since 2017. And Merck has an entire program called the Sequevity program. This is all on my Substack. Other manufacturers have either DNA or self-replicating RNA vaccines. Many veterinarians think they're completely unnecessary, that, the swine can be managed with traditional vaccines. But the companies have new products. They want to sell new products. And so the genetic vaccines are used. There's been no attention to whether or not any of the genetic material gets in humans. Now, with the curing and cooking of pork, it's pretty unlikely that any nucleic acids would survive, informed in RNA or DNA. But the beef supply is something different. And the US RDA has got plenty of programs now with the companies changing the standard beef, get what's considered a a core pack, and then for eating the grass, they get a clostridial pack, and then a reproductive pack. They're standard vaccines. Again, there's no problem with the beef supply, but the genetic vaccines are coming. The USRDA has announced this. And then lastly, there has been efforts to directly have plants and other edible forms of food actually be loaded with genetic material to vaccinate humans. And so I have this on the Substack of the successes that have been done. There are no current produce that are vaccinated, particularly to vaccinate us. So I don't want to get people worried right now, but it could be coming. And in watermelon juice and a few other forms of plants, they've been able to get the genetic material to cross the human GI tract. So many are pushing right now all over to get transparency legislation, to get it labeled so we know what we're eating right now. A lot of farmers are coming forward saying, listen, we don't want to use this stuff, and they want the marketing advantage of being more natural or potentially organic. So the food supply there feeding into gender dysphoria, it's certainly possible. But I think the hormones, I think you're onto something, because I'll tell you the other thing, the kids are growing taller, but the onset of puberty is sooner.
Right. And before we get, since you mentioned it, and I want to get into how this all comes together in the conversation of the chemicals, but so you mentioned that the food supply. Now, I recently saw a clip of you discussing this. Can you comment on that for me in regard to whether these are potentially like the mRNA or the spike protein? There's a lot. I've got a lot of people reaching out about that in general, and your work in particular. So are there risks there, whether it's the pork or the beef or anything in regard to the vaccines and the ingredients?
Again, we have no assurances. The U.S. government has not done transference studies, so we can't say anything's absolutely safe. I can tell you about my review. I think the genetic vaccines used in pork are unlikely to have transference into humans. Beef is different because we eat beef a lot more raw. Some countries actually eat completely raw beef, and then clearly into plants, it would be a whole different ball game. What we know there is the WHO in 2005 held a conference on edible vaccines and said if these come forward, the U.S. FDA should be involved. Right now, the companies are saying, listen, it's not for humans, it's for the animals. So the US FDA doesn't need to be involved. So they're not being policed. And Holly Jones, a representative of Missouri, led a bill in Missouri, just a transparency legislation to say, listen, in the pigs right now, the farms that are using genetic vaccines, we want to label, and then in the beef. And Attorney Tom Renz assisted Holly Jones. And it's interesting, they just wanted transparency legislation. And it turns out there's two major beef suppliers. One is the U.S. Cattlemen's Association. Former president is Brooke Miller, who's a doctor. Brooke and I have been on stage together. U.S. Cattlemen's, they wanted transparency. They wanted to say, listen, if genetics are in the beef, to put a label. And then the National Cattlemen's and Beef Association was completely against transparency, and they lobbied along party lines. Interestingly, these two cattlemen associations came up in a battle in 2015 for a country of origin labeling. And again, the good guys wanted to just have a label. Where did the beef come from? And the bad guys wanted complete transparency. So it turns out the bad guys likely are, get funding from Gates Foundation, the Chinese, and others. And just so people know, the beef supply largely in the United States comes from America, Canada, Brazil, and then the unknown piece to this is China.
Man, there's so many things that I would love. Just the plant vaccines, we talked about that a lot. There's so much there, but I want to make sure I focus on the point of today. But man, we should reconnect on that in general, because I've been saying something about that since the beginning of all this. The Pfizer's own research talked about them, in both ways, both internally and externally, like packing your cells to be the creators of drugs, but also the outside the world. It's so alarming. But so taking all that in, because that is important in the same conversation. So we've talked about autism in general and how that's an overlap. There's a correlation there with the gender dysphoria conversation. But then we've taken a step back and discussed what could be causing that. We can combine this with the discussion of other things we know in the atmosphere, in the environment, glyphosate, dioxins, PFAS, all endocrine disrupting chemicals. So what's your thought on that bigger topic in regard to causing gender dysphoria, and how much do you think that is what we're seeing today?
I can't possibly know. I'm an epidemiologist, trained in studying the distribution and determinants of disease, particularly chronic disease like autism. But boy, we should have a Manhattan Project to see if there's any leads. I've summarized them so far: hypervaccination, potentially specific vaccines like rubella, hypervitaminosis A, vitamin A has been brought up, just too high of a dose. And then as we approach puberty, I think it's very plausible that hormones in the food supply could be influencing things. And
well, taking just the vaccine itself, to what degree do you think that might be playing a factor? Let's take it so the COVID-19 injection, the varying mRNA versions. Do you think there's a connection there with the so would you consider the vaccine itself or the chemicals in it an endocrine disrupting chemical? Would it be in that category for you?
Oh, good point. So just the COVID-19 vaccine. And so the uptake in children approaching puberty, I guess potentially could play a role there. We know in a study by Gatt and colleagues and a second one by Hong, Chinese, that on the male side, the vaccine clearly drops sperm motility and count. But the mechanism it may do that is actually by dropping testosterone levels. That's very important because there is testicular toxicity. And it lasts for about 6 months, and then it comes back, and then another shot. It's going to be depressed again. Now, on the female side, what we know there is a giant project called the EVA project clearly showed COVID-19 vaccination disrupts menstruation 78% of the time. I mean, it really disrupts ovarian function and uterine function for sure. Multiple studies show that, and anything that can influence the ovarian cycle is going to influence puberty in some way. So I think you're right. Widespread use of COVID-19 vaccines could be playing into disruptions as the kids approach puberty and go through puberty. Any disruption in the normal process, by definition, is going to lead some to have gender dysphoria, right? It makes sense. There's enough gender ambiguity with normal puberty. Now add in these other factors, particularly COVID-19 shots, it then starts to up the ante. So I think that's a good integrative framework. There's a variety of things going on. None of them are good. And it's going to lead some kids to a pathway of not being happy with their gender. And they could be suggestible. And if a counselor or another person in authority in their circles suggests they change their gender, they could start a gender journey and be strongly encouraged to do so. Some countries, Christian, the parents would be criminalized to stop it. And that would be in Canada, for instance, some states in the United States.
It's just so disconcerting. Well, I guess we can finish. Well, I'd like to actually show you this real quickly for people in the show, or the interview, to see that there is scientific literature backing up the overlap directly with endocrine disrupting chemicals and leading specifically to experiencing gender dysphoria. So it's not even up for debate, scientifically speaking, that these things are happening. So the question becomes, is that all of what's happening, some of what's happening, or is it being abused? Is it being ignored? This is what I find most important. And one thing, I don't know if I was recently just talking about this. If you've seen that there are people from within the World Professional Association, didn't mean to hit that, for transgender health, and both the president-elect as well as people that work there have even resigned their posts because they think that the people are being sloppy with treatments given to kids. So this is coming from the Associated Press in regard to the people that work at one of the leading clinics. And yet we're at a point now where it's considered like we're not allowed to point this stuff out, right? So I wanted your thoughts on, so we've kind of made it clear that there's an overlap here. You've done a lot of work. I was recently showing your Substack post about the surgeries, the puberty blockers. So can you speak to that for me and where the risks are?
It's true. So the determinants of gender dysphoria are pretty clearly autism and other environmental factors that likely come in through our diet, food, or water supply. And I think you're starting to hit on those. We clearly need more. It's something, obviously, that's a big change from childhood 50 years ago or 60 years ago, a huge change. Now, what's in the minds of doctors, and I can tell you, I'm a leading doctor in the United States. I'm the most published person in my field in the world of history. I've been a leader in COVID. Under no conditions would I ever consider a gender change surgery on a normal child, ever. I would never consider puberty blockers at the pituitary level or direct androgens, estrogens. Never.
Well,
Never.
you say on would you consider puberty blockers appropriate for any child?
No, never.
Yeah, okay,
Because
just
I took a
clarifying.
Hippocratic oath to, above all, do no harm. I've reviewed the literature. Everything I've just mentioned does great harm.
Right.
And I took an oath to fight disease. And this is not the appropriate way to fight disease. If there's autism, gender dysphoria, various contaminants in the food, there's other ways of dealing with that, but not to permanently change these children. This is what we know on the surgeries. The surgeries are striking. Probably the least harmful is for a boy to get breast implants. And I think any adult man who wants to get breast implants and dress up like a girl, that they're entitled to do that. I think they should pay for it themselves. We should take it out of the Affordable Care Act. Right now in the United States, we're paying for the breast implants for these men. And if they want to do that, that's their own decision. Now, once we get to children, what's going on there is not only the breast implants in the boys, but they're having penile inversion vaginoplasty. This is a brutal surgery where the penis is filleted open, it's cored out, and then it's inverted to make a rudimentary vagina up in a man's pelvis, which isn't meant to actually have a vagina there. It's fraught with complications. The testicles are removed. There's no return from this surgery. It doesn't even work well as a rudimentary vagina. On the girls' side, there is phalloplasty. That is the creation of a penis, taking a big chunk out of the leg or the arm, trying to route the urine through it. It doesn't work, burying the base of the clitoris. The rudimentary penis, can't have any real sexual function. And then what's even worse is called metidioplasty, something to try to make the clitoris get larger. Gets about as big as a cocktail weenie. Again, can't do anything. The urine flow is disrupted. In a recent paper of people having these surgeries, every single one of them is complicated, multiple complications, revisions. They're sterilizing surgeries. This is just horrific. If you scroll down, you can see the pictures of these surgeries, Christian. I encourage anybody to. Yeah, anybody wants that, maybe we'll do it for, this is viewer discretion advice.
Right. Just say that beforehand. So I'm going to scroll down. I did this on my show as well. There's some pretty graphic images. So if there are children watching, make sure that we're about to scroll down. I do think it's important though. Both the numbers, which actually really blow my mind. What stood out to me was, go ahead. You want to comment?
Yeah, 129, I believe it was 129 women. This is for the creation of the penis. 281 complications and 142 revisions. I mean, this is a failed surgery. I as a doctor, I would never consider this surgery. This surgery is a bust.
The mental health point really stood out to me. 20%, which, I mean, the whole point of what the argument about some of this is that it predominantly is about helping their mental health, because they say it's a disorder, at least from the medical side, as they're all saying that's not the case. But it gets worse in 20% of the cases. You're right. That's failed in any scientific metric or medical.
Right. And actually, there are broader studies. The whole transgender clinical program worsens the psychiatric burden of disease. A paper by Jackson and colleagues from the UK shows it increases all-cause mortality, suicide, homicide, death from other causes. It's 80% of the time it's sterilizing. This is bad medicine. And, no doctor should be doing this. The states should not have to have laws to shut it down, because medicine shouldn't do this. The doctors are doing it in Russia, and Putin is trying to shut it down in Russia. They're trying to shut it down in Indonesia. It's occurring organically all over the world. United States, by the way, is not the leader here. The leader is the Netherlands and elsewhere. United States is following some type of world lead here. It's very disturbing.
That's an important point to think about too, for those that always tend to kind of focus on like the US as the boogeyman. I think that we can see the global agenda playing out really strongly right now. I think that's important. Well, the last thing I want to, kind of just put a fine point on is that what we just discussed, in a general sense, I would agree. I think that there's nothing, I wouldn't even call this bad medicine. I wouldn't call this medicine. I think this is something that's so off the beaten path. It doesn't make scientific sense. There's a lot of things that just gets, kind of just paved right over. But when it comes to the children in particular, How do you make sense of this? How do we make sense of something where we have no long-term studies, right? I mean, I know it's just your opinion, but I mean, from as a doctor, how do you explain this? Just like we saw with the COVID-19 thing, like how are people not speaking up about this when we know that they're like, as I just showed you, the Associated Press, Reuters, they say themselves that they have bone problems, infertility issues. We don't have long-term studies. At what point did this even get allowed at some level? I don't understand this.
In 2021, the American Medical Association said we should no longer put gender on the birth certificate. Where did that come from? You know, there's board exam questions now where for gender dysphoria in a prepubertal child, the correct answer is to start puberty blockers. It's in doctors' board exams. So somehow the orthodoxy in medicine swang right into this without any discussion. Every academic medical center is either has gender change surgeries or is going to do them, have programs. This has now been quickly become part of mainstream medicine all over the world at the same time. One can't explain this. You know, with COVID, you could say, okay, it's a virus. It spread all over the world. Everyone was scared. The pandemic response had all these shortcomings. And there was liability protection in the United States through the CARES Act and the PrEP Act. Here, this tsunami of transgenderism is not under any type of health emergency.
Right.
So there's not going to be any immunity here. So, you know, I can tell you, I'll talk to the doctors right now. The doctors doing this, if there's even an ounce of regret in any child or family, watch out. The liability is going to be through the roof because the changes are lifelong. It's already coming. The attorneys are sharpening their pens right now. They are getting ready for a tsunami of litigation. These doctors are going to have nothing to stand on because experts like me are going to say, listen, this violates good medicine, violates the community standard of care, is to let a child go through natural puberty. If they need cognitive behavioral therapy, get therapy. But the answer for a psychological condition is not hormones and mutilating surgery. It can't be. Right. No reasonable jury is gonna believe it.
Well, and on top of that, what we were showing in the Associated Press article is that the president-elect of the leading group is telling you that in some cases people are being sloppy. They're not letting some children who just might be questioning gender or otherwise being driven to transgender puberty blockers. And so there's obviously a problem there. So again, on the children's side of this, you know, why do you have an opinion on why there seems to be a focus almost from the industry of this on children? That's just my personal opinion, but do you have a thought on that?
It seems to be an indoctrination in the very early age with these drag queen shows, the profuse, pouring in of pornography in schools is coming in through the publishers. The teachers, I asked teachers about this. I said, where's it coming from? They wouldn't even know. They open up the boxes and they're just loaded with books, pornographic books. They're starting sex clubs in elementary school for kids after school to learn various sexual acts. There's some type of distorted perversion that's spreading from mind to mind right now. It's like an infectious disease. It's more infectious than COVID. It's a distorted, hypersexual, perverted thought pattern that's basically enveloping the world.
That's terrifying. Well, I mean, what is a positive note here is that there are people like you and others out there that are speaking up as during COVID and saying there's something wrong here. And quite frankly, I think more people see this than we realize, like other topics. But right now we're in the middle of the fervor of this political topic. And so people, just like with COVID, are terrified to speak up. But it's time people found their courage, because this is not okay. And this really does kind of put me off, you know, in a very, this is, when it comes to the children, there's something that I just can't wrap my mind around. So do you have any other important thoughts to include in all this? And
no, you covered it. And I congratulate you on your scholarship on these other environmental exposures, even considering the COVID vaccine. Obviously, there's been some dramatic change in the last few years and this explosion. But to see our president replace the American flag as the center flag, in the Capitol with the gay pride flag, to see naked breasts and wide open nudity and lewdness and debauchery on the grounds of the White House. We've lost all dignity, all decorum. We seem to be in some type of moral free fall right now. And it's all over the world, Christian. That's the thing. It's worldwide and simultaneous. People are just trying to get their moorings and figure out what to do.
Right. Right. Well, I think this is important. And I think that people need to take a step back if they're in that position and really ask themselves what they think they care about, what matters. And I think you'll quickly see that there's something wrong here at the very least. So thank you for coming on and talking about this. I know this, I'm still trying to find an endocrinologist as well, and somebody who's willing to kind of, specialize and talk about this, but I find it interesting that I've had such a hard time finding anybody that's willing to talk about it. And I think it's the fervor, like we talked about.
Yeah.
But well, thank you for being here again, Dr. Peter McCullough, and everybody else. Please check out his work because he's doing outstanding stuff, the wellness company and everything else. And, anything else you want to leave us with, upcoming work? Social media?
Just make sure you check out my Substack, Courageous Discourse, one of the hottest Substacks around. I'm covering the transgender issue with great assiduousness. Make sure you check out my podcast, America Out Loud Talk Radio, McCullough Report. I'm interviewing probably the top child psychiatrist on an upcoming episode, giving parents some hard instructions of what they need to follow here to try to navigate their kids through this perilous time. My kids are all grown up right now, Christian. I got to tell you, I feel fortunate. They've kind of been through, I guess, a risk period, but I really am very empathetic to young parents right now with kids trying to navigate through school right now. It's every parent needs to be listening to the Last American Vagabond and other independent sources of media. So thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And as that's important to think about, guys, is we need to find our way to maneuver this in the right way. So thank you for being here. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.